Good morning. Thank you all for coming to this wonderful event. How many times, raise your hand if you've been here before. Fabulous. With this time, every time you come to the Clinton Presidential Center, we hope to give you something different, something that is educational and impactful. Today, we have the CIA with us. But before I get started, can I get you to the books that you have in your hand? Flip to the back page. And there's a section in there where they have spaces for you to take notes. Please know that that's why we left the pencil, and you have this information booklet, and you have a space to take notes from. So can we do that? This event is designed to be interactive. So as you listen to the panelists, think about some questions you want to ask. I know that we always have information and want to know more about the working of the CIA. So let me go on and get started because we have a wonderful panel with a moderator, and I'm going to introduce to you your moderator for today. His name is Malcolm Glover, and Malcolm can be heard weekday mornings as the local news host for Morning Edition. He produces daily news for radio newscasts, as well as in-depth featured reports. Malcolm also produced the award-winning Impact of War. It is a series that explores the hardships and the triumphs of U.S. armed forces. Malcolm has worked for MTV. He has worked for MTV News, MSNBC, and has traveled the world to complete humanitarian projects and lead communication initiatives in the Sudan, Kenya, Israel, China, Belize, and Brazil. Malcolm appears regularly on AETN's Arkansas Week, where journalists discusses issues in the news. In 2012, he was on Arkansas Business list of the new influential 20 in their 20s. Originally from Maryland, Malcolm stays active in Arkansas, and he has completed 3 marathons. He's currently working on a PhD in leadership at the University of Central Arkansas. Ladies and gentlemen, your moderator, Mr. Malcolm Glover.
All right, good morning, everyone. So one of the things that we want this session to be about is we want it to be interactive. We want you involved. We want you to ask questions just as much as I'm going to ask questions. So it's very important to be listening and thinking about some of the issues that are not only in that booklet, but some of the issues that you might have concerns about as we move forward. So for those of you who may not know, and for those of you who do know, we're here today because something important happened yesterday. More than 300 documents were declassified by the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, about intelligence and policymaking, presidential policymaking during the Bosnian conflict, a war from 1992 to around 1995 that left more than 100,000 people dead. Now, I know many of us have talked about war and conflict abroad, particularly in the last couple of years, and more often than not, those conflicts are in the Middle East. I'm sure you've talked about it around the kitchen table, talked about it with friends and family members, and sometimes even talk about those conflicts in school. Well, back during the Clinton administration, the Bosnian War had been called one of the worst armed conflicts in Europe since World War II. But in the 1990s, the American public was a little bit uneasy at first about getting involved in the Bosnian conflict. And yesterday, former President Bill Clinton was here, and he talked about how at that time when he rallied advisors to talk about these issues and he spoke with members of our intelligence community about how to get involved, he recognized that issues of international consequence can't be put to public opinion polls. Sometimes you have to weigh the intelligence and then do what you think is best and what you think is right. So 2 members of our panel today have been deeply involved with intelligence, and I want to briefly introduce them And then both of them will talk about how they got involved with intelligence and also some of the roles that they played in reference to the Bosnian conflict. So one of our panelists, first off, is Leon Firth, who at that time was the National Security Advisor to Vice President Al Gore from 1993 to 2001. Mr. Firth, could you raise your hand? Blue tie. Mr. Firth is currently a professor in the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. Now, back then as the Vice President's National Security Advisor, Mr. Firth created and managed 5 binational commissions with Russia, South Africa, Egypt, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. Among other important initiatives, he led efforts to marshal international support for sanctions against, at that time, the Slobodan Milosevic regime, contributing to the victory of democracy in the Balkans. He also raised awareness about the effects to prevent the spread of HIV/AIDS in Africa, to denuclearize former Soviet states from providing alternative energy sources and employment opportunities for nuclear scientists, and he worked on efforts to win China's cooperation in protecting the environment and reducing pollution. That's Mr. Leon Firth. We appreciate you for being here today. And then our other panelist in the striped tie is Dr. John Gannon. At that point in time, he was CIA Deputy Director for Intelligence from 1995 to 1997. Dr. Gannon is currently an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's National Security Studies program. And prior to joining Georgetown, Dr. Gannon served in the most senior analytical positions, one of the most senior analytical positions at the CIA and in the intelligence community as Deputy Director for Intelligence at the CIA, Chairman of the National Intelligence Council, and Assistant Director of Central Intelligence for Analysis and Production. He led the establishment of the DCI Interagency Balkan Task Force, and he headed the White House team in the Department of Homeland Security Transition Planning Office, standing up for the Information Analysis and Infrastructure Protection Directorate. In 2004, President George W. Bush awarded him the National Security Medal, the nation's highest intelligence award. Let's have a round of applause for both Leon Firth and Dr. John Gannon. There are a lot of words to take in when we talk about events abroad, historic events, and when we talk about intelligence. So in many ways, what we'll try to do is break things down today, and we want to make this discussion interesting, informative, and fun. Because one day, some of you may want to work with the CIA or work for the CIA, and I think particularly the work of the intelligence agency, the Central Intelligence Agency, has been in vogue because of the exploits of Claire Danes as Carrie Matheson on that Showtime show Homeland. So we want to make it interesting, and we're going to start off by just brief opening statements from both of our panelists. And I'm wondering, as you talk about not only your work then, if you could just tell us how you first got involved in intelligence. Whichever one would like to go first.
Is it working? What? It's on. Good. Okay, well, first of all, just to be clear, I am not now, nor have I ever been, a member of the Central Intelligence Agency. That's true. I mean, I never told you this, John, but it served my purposes that you should not know. But no, I began my working career as a Foreign Service officer in the U.S. State Department. That's real, it's not cover. And then at a certain time in my life, I decided I was going to move locations. I became a Hill staffer and worked as a senior member of staff on the House Select Committee on Intelligence, which is an oversight committee in the Congress. And there I met then Representative Gore, and he and I began to work together on issues that interested him intensely at the time, like arms control and nuclear weapons. And when he became a senator, I became a member of his personal staff and followed him into the White House as his national security advisor, and stayed in that job until the end of the second Clinton administration, then retired from government, and I began to lecture to graduate students at the Elliott School at the George Washington University. However, because of the way my life and my career ran, I was fortunate enough to have many different encounters with the intelligence community, and became aware of its capabilities and of its limitations sometimes, but at least I had a knowledgeable awareness of what was going on and what it meant to be able to ask a question and get an answer that would be the best available in the government, and maybe the best available anywhere. And John and I have had exchanges and intersections often in our working lifetimes. So it was very interesting for us to come together last night and to have on our panel enough people to sort of reassemble a cross-section of how the U.S. government at the time was organized to deal with the problem of war in the Balkans, both from the point of view of making decisions and policy and the point of view of intelligence. John?
Thank you, Leon. It's great to be here and great to see all of you here. I'll go back to when I graduated from a college, undergraduate at Holy Cross. I went off to Jamaica for a year in a program, a volunteer program to teach there, and that sort of whetted my appetite for living in foreign cultures and learning about how other people live and how in the different values that are expressed in the way they live. I then went into the Navy and ultimately spent about 23 years in the Navy Reserves and 22 months in Vietnam. That also sort of enhanced my interest in working in international relations. Went to graduate school and ultimately got a doctorate out of Washington University in St. Louis in history, but focused on international relations. I then was headed for the Foreign Service, got diverted, came into CIA, and had an absolutely wonderful career there, which I define as continuing education, always stimulated, always challenged. I had about 44 jobs that I've had in the course of my career, always stretching me and always helping me to learn more and more about the complicated but wonderful world we live in. I had the opportunity, as Leon said, to work with him, and I can tell you I have tremendous respect for the job that he did in many different incarnations, but in particular in the Balkans, where we worked together, and he was responsible for the sanctions, for developing and then implementing a sanctions regime that had tremendous impact on bringing Slobodan Milosevic ultimately to the conference table and winning the peace that we had in the Dayton Accords. So that's our backgrounds, and I will say that I can say a lot of great things about Leon, and he can do the same things, I hope, about me. But I will say that I had the opportunity to chat with a number of you, and I'm very impressed about how you are looking at your futures. A lot of you know where you want to go to school. You know what you want to be when what career you want to choose. So I hope that you will know that we are absolutely we're delighted to be in your company. So what I'd ask, if there's anybody out there that has a question you really want to ask but you're afraid to ask it, because that really is what energizes us and makes us feel that it's worth it for us to be here and to hear from you. Having an effect already. This is great.
I think that's a very good point. And I think before we start taking questions, not only from the stage, but also from the audience, gentlemen, so many of us, when we think about war and when we think about conflict, we immediately think about the Middle East. We think of Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria, because that's been what has been talked about on the news and in this country over and over again. So I'm wondering, to kick things off, if we can take a step back in time. And for members of the audience, tell us, what were things like then? What were you hearing? What were you seeing? What were you experiencing in reference to the Bosnian conflict? What were things like? What were the chief concerns?
Go ahead, John.
Well, I had the advantage of being the Balkans branch chief at CIA back in the 80s, and at that time, we were very impressed, in fact, by the diversity, particularly of Bosnia, the Muslim and the Bosnian Muslims and the Bosnian Croats and the Bosnian Serbs were living together in relative harmony in Sarajevo. So hold that thought, that the people had established a modus vivendi among the cultural groups that really was impressive and exciting, really, to visit Sarajevo. But at the same time, the overall system of managing the 6 republics in Yugoslavia, we always knew was inefficient. They had a rotating presidency where they would rotate from the Croats to the Serbs to the Muslims, and they each would prove how inefficient they could be in managing what was an economy in difficulty. And against that background of economic decline or struggle, and you always want to look when countries get into economic difficulty. That's when political issues can arise. It can become very difficult and can lead to the kind of things that happened in Yugoslavia. But we noted also by the end of the 80s, President Milosevic in Serbia was making speeches about the greatest Serbia, that is all the Serbs who lived in other republics apart from Serbia, and very antagonistic kinds of remarks that were causing people to want to mobilize on the basis of their ethnic background. And then when we finally did have in 1990, in 1991, the collapse of the Yugoslav system, we saw the organization that had been suppressed for so many years. We saw it develop their political parties on an ethnic basis, and hatreds that had been dormant or really non-existent for younger generations for many years brought back to the forefront, and then that led to a kind of call to arms, and then and as Slovenia broke away, relatively peacefully, then the conflict between Croatia and Serbia became much more violent and potentially violent. And then in 1992, when Bosnia declared its independence, Bosnia was a country that was made up with a significant portion of ethnic Serbs, ethnic Croats, and Muslims. So you had all the parties to that larger conflict represented there, and so it was an intensified fight driven by ethnic identity to break up Yugoslavia in terms of bringing the individual ethnic groups into larger constellations of their own ethnic identity. So that's how it disintegrated. But in my own experience, I saw what was a wonderful multicultural environment in Sarajevo break down, and the ethnic hatreds grow and develop. And our government, because I was there in the transition from the George H.W. Bush administration, and you have to have sympathy for that administration, which had dealt, I think, very well with the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, the transformation, the beginning of the transformation of our security architecture in Europe, then German unification, which I thought was magnificently managed by the Bush administration. There was not adequate attention paid to what was happening in Bosnia, even though I think the Bush administration did take some steps with regard to sanctions, which Leon can talk about much more competently than I can. So there were efforts made that were inadequate, really, to stop the growth of the ethnic hatreds that were becoming more and more part of the politics of the former Yugoslavia. And so we moved, particularly after 1992, with the Declaration of Independence for Bosnia. The Clinton administration had very weak tools to deal with what was a growing crisis in a very volatile area of Europe. And the debate within the intelligence community, we had done a national intelligence estimate where you bring all the members of the intelligence community together to talk about what we in a high stakes issue, what we see as the likely outcome. And in that estimate, we said that Yugoslavia is likely to break up, and there's not much anybody can do about it. And that was really reflecting a view that was held in some elements of the Bush administration, not all of them. But the Clinton administration then had to deal with what was a growing conflict when it was very clear that not only were there things that could be done about it, but if we didn't do something about it, not only were you going to have internal issues to deal with in Yugoslavia, but spillover into other countries was also likely in terms of the refugee crisis that would occur. You had ethnic Hungarians in Croatia, for example. You began to have demands for Hungary to redesign its borders because there were a lot of Hungarians in Romania, some so if everybody was going to redo their borders, there really had to be very strong international pressure, and it really did require the United States to take seriously the issues in the former Yugoslavia because of the negative implications. And the Clinton administration, I believe, did a magnificent job with people like Leon to deal with this crisis. So that's enough for me.
Okay.
You said you have a different perspective.
Somewhat. It's both personal and professional. At the personal level, when I was in the Foreign Service, my family, my wife and children and I were posted to Zagreb, which is the capital of the Croatian Republic, and we lived there for a little bit over 2 years, and traveled a bit within the region. So when the news would come in about what was being destroyed where and who was being killed where, it had a more direct meaning. You know, I don't know whether any of you have seen any pictures, or maybe somebody was lucky enough once to visit the city of Dubrovnik on the Adriatic coast. It's very hard to imagine any place more magnificent than that. And my feelings about what was going on in that country began to take a decisive turn. In fact, they turned decisively when news came that Dubrovnik was being shelled by Serbs. And I thought that the destruction of anything that magnificent meant that something truly bad, truly evil had happened in the minds of the people who were willing to do that. And I felt it marked the end of the time when keeping Yugoslavia in one piece was terribly important to the United States. It had been important for 30 years because Yugoslavia in one piece prevented the Soviet Union from dominating the region and from pushing towards the Adriatic. It was very strategically important that Yugoslavia's independence and its wholeness be protected. But meanwhile, as the Clinton administration began, the Soviet Union had already disintegrated. It wasn't there anymore. And the Warsaw Pact had disintegrated. It wasn't there anymore. And what we had instead was a kind of total blank slate about what was going to happen in the world and what the United States should do with its power and its influence in order to try to guide events. And so thinking about the future of these republics that were emerging from the old Yugoslavia, and particularly thinking about what was going on in Bosnia, took on a different coloration because, as I said, with our old enemy gone, we had to rethink the relative importance of things in the world and change almost on the wing how we approach them. And so when you looked at what was going on in Croatia and in Bosnia, you had to begin to ask questions like, what kind of people are we in the Western Alliance and NATO if we have the means to deal with this, but we choose not to? If we sit back and watch people who lived right on the edge of the NATO alliance tear each other to shreds, I mean, was it of no interest to us so long as we weren't worried about a third party who was our big enemy? Or was it of interest to us because people whose hatred for each other had gotten completely out of control, okay, were at war, and we had, if we wished to, sufficient power to deal with that issue, but for one reason or another decided it just wasn't important enough. And of course, in the years since then, that kind of question has had to be answered repeatedly. Anyway, around that time, that's the shelling of Dubrovnik, I began to talk to my boss, who was then Senator Gore. He went to the floor of the Senate, same day, same time as Senator Dole, Republican. The two of them were the first members of the Senate to start talking about the meaning of what was going on in this conflict, and about the fact that it had to matter to America, even though our country was very tired of war after so much devastation in Vietnam, and very much not interested in becoming involved in a distant place that hardly anybody could find on a map. And so the question was, one, how do you react as officials of a great people? What do you decide to recommend to the president that he do in their name in this situation? And that's where sort of the personal, the historical, and the global issues started to come together. Because the biggest question that we were facing was, what kind of world is going to come out of this? All the old rules, all the old ideas about how things were organized had fallen to pieces. And so what did it mean if people are right on the edge of Europe, in Europe really, were simply allowed to continue into this terrible future? Because it had implications for all the rest of us. And eventually, in the Clinton administration, it was accepted that what was going on in that area was meaningful to the United States, and it was meaningful enough to the point where ultimately we would be prepared to use force to bring it to an end.
You know, I think if we tie both comments together, the important thing to remember is that in many instances, what at one point in time were relatively stable communities, because of economic unrest, scarce resources, people began to fracture, they began to split apart, they began to care more about their ethnic differences than the totality of their communities. And so what ends up happening? Conflict. And then at the presidential level, presidents have an important decision to make, especially when it comes to a conflict halfway around the world. Do I get involved? Do I allow our people to get involved, our resources or the resources of our allies, the NATO alliance, to get involved in this conflict, or do we sit by and let things happen on their own because it's not happening directly in our country? It's so important how just I guess almost it can seem like in a blink of an eye, things can change. And total communities can be wiped out. People can be displaced from their homes. They can be killed only because of who they worship, their ethnic background, what they believe in, or the region that they live in. And it happens over and over again, not only in the situation in Bosnia, but we can think of situations that happen today. And we're going to continue to talk about some of this, but I'm wondering, are there any opening questions from the audience just yet? The young lady right there in the second row.
I have a question for both of you. I was looking through the documents and I noticed that there was an extension on one of them. Why was there a classification extension on it? And if these documents are declassified, then why are some of the parts still whited out? Like where you can't see what's underneath them?
So some documents have been declassified, but others are still whited out. What's the reasoning for that? Why some, not others, and why not everything in totality?
I think you could see that in a positive light if you see the folks who were declassifying want to release as much information as they can, but there are times when releasing names of individuals, for example, creates a sensitivity and a vulnerability for either for that individual or for a broader interest of the United States government, or you may be revealing sources of our information and or the methods by which, sensitive methods of intelligence. So it almost always is going to be a partial release when you look at the totality of the information. But you want to encourage the government to do as much as it can to really work hard, and they do have to work hard, to determine what really can be released at minimum or no risk, and what really is high risk in revealing. And I think what we see in the documents that have been released, 300 or so, it is that it was inevitable there would be some part, particularly these are fairly fresh documents. These are, I think, some of the youngest, as we call them, documents that have been released in memory. So that's, I don't know, does that answer your question? Okay.
Another question? We have some in the front over here. Hold on one second. A mic is coming for you, a microphone. Go ahead.
Why do you think that force is the only way to bring war to an end? Don't you think it's kind of rough to think that violence will increase violence? It's not smart to keep increasing violence because innocent people will get hurt, just like the 9/11.
Does violence beget violence, gentlemen?
I would agree with you. Violence was essentially the last resort. We spent years negotiating. Sometimes the Europeans were negotiating, sometimes we were negotiating in a constant effort to get, really to get the Serbs to stand down what they were doing, because in our opinion, the Serbs, there might be fault on both sides, but the Serbs were clearly the aggressors. And it's only when our efforts failed and we gave up any expectation that efforts to bargain or negotiate would work, that we turned to the question of using force. And one of the unfortunate truths about international affairs is that sometimes goodwill and cooperation work, and sometimes, in the face of an ongoing evil, they don't. The other thing that's of interest is that, especially in those days, but still today, the United States is unique in having the means to reach out at huge distances. And so it isn't a question of saying, well, it's a tragedy, but we can't do anything about it. You get to the point where it's a tragedy, and yes, we could. And then the issue is, will we? We never stopped trying to negotiate an end to the hostilities. In fact, we continued to negotiate at every opportunity. Some of our best people were involved in this process. A number of the finest members of the Foreign Service died on a road on their way driving to Belgrade because the Serbs would let them fly in. And they died in a burning military vehicle. And their mission was to bring this thing to a negotiated conclusion. The overwhelming issue here, I think, is very human, and that is, how long does hatred last? Is it possible either to confine it, control it, or ultimately to help it go away? And that was the design and the purpose of what we were trying to do. But there were no fixed, no cookbook answers to how to do that.
More questions from the audience?
Can I just take that one?
Sure.
That's a very important question. I wanted to comment too. From a personal standpoint, my father was missing in action in World War II for almost a year. I served 22 months in Vietnam. 56,000 of my contemporaries died in that war. War is terrible. There's no question about it. And I think that when you sit as I did in the margins of foreign policy discussions, you're always aware that when you talk about committing to war-based solutions, you're talking about other people's children. This is a very heavy responsibility that sits on governments. My observation during the Bosnian conflict that as Leon said, violence would be the last resort, and the goal was to bring those who were committing violence, particularly the Serbs and others, to the table so that the violence could be ended. We were forced toward the end of that conflict to use bombing as a resort, but I think any fair assessment of that conflict would judge that bombing had a direct and positive impact in bringing an end to that conflict. But for most of the time, as Leon could tell you, the sanctions regime that he managed really was I think the strongest instrument that we had to bring an end to violence that we weren't causing. But also in terms of the way a government needs to manage its resources, we were not talking about invading the Balkans or bringing massive amounts of U.S. troops there. I think our policy, upon the policy side, they tried very hard to bring those who were perpetrating violence to the conference table and to avoid having to put U.S. forces there on the ground. So it's a very difficult set of issues you have to deal with. But your question is one for the ages, and I hope you will. When all of you, come to inherit some of the positions that we had, you will feel the same way you do right now. Avoiding violence is always a noble goal worth pursuing absolutely to the end. Any option is better than violence. And I think we've seen, for example, in Afghanistan and Iraq today, that we've been fighting wars, probably too many wars with too few military folks. And there's a terrible burden you put on your own military. So there are consequences to the decisions about using military too that you always want to be able to make in the most responsible way you can. But anyway, I want to say that's you've asked a very important question, and I think it weighed heavily on the Clinton policymakers.
Right here, the young lady in the white shirt.
Due to the government shutdown, how would this affect the CIA?
I missed that question.
Due to the government shutdown, how will that affect the CIA in its work?
I assure you, for any foreign country listening to this, the CIA will continue in operation, and every priority that it had 2 days ago, it will have today, and it will have the resources to execute all of the policies that will allow us to succeed. What the CIA will do is prioritize the use of its resources, and some people who are doing jobs that are not directly related to the most critical missions will be furloughed. Others, but the critical missions will be identified and they will be sustained, I absolutely assure you.
We're still gathering intelligence and sifting through information to keep people safe. The young lady right here in the front row.
From my understanding, our conflict with Syria is a lot similar to the Bosnian conflict. What do you think our government can do to end this conflict?
She says, from her understanding, our conflict in Syria in some ways is similar to the Bosnian conflict. And what, if anything, can the government do from your experience? What, if anything, should the government do in reference to what's happening right now in Syria to end that dispute?
Thanks.
I'll follow up. I'll clean up.
Right. Another dead-on question. I stay in touch with Vice President Gore by email most of the time. And one of the last messages was, well, Leon, what would you do? And I wrote back and said, I don't know, what would you do? And it is very, very difficult. One of the advantages we had in the Clinton administration in dealing with Bosnia was that for all sorts of reasons, at that time, the Russian Federation, the successor to the Soviet Union, was ready to be cooperative in the Security Council. And the Chinese were not interested in being disruptive. Given those two facts, it was possible to get votes in the Security Council which were creating new kinds of international law and arrangements that tremendously helped us develop a almost worldwide diplomacy aimed at ending the war. So, for example, the Security Council passed a series of sanctions resolutions which basically said no more trade with Serbia until things are brought to a conclusion in the following goods. And the sanctions got tighter and tighter. And it was willing to also authorize the setting up of machinery to enforce those sanctions. There was a flotilla in the Adriatic to prevent oil shipments from reaching Serbia. There were blockades all around Serbia to prevent goods from flowing into that country that were on the proscribed list, and so on. Those sanctions really made a dent, not only in the Serbian economy, but they began to undermine the power of Serbia's president, Slobodan Milosevic, and they helped push him towards negotiations. Although even then, it required an intense bombing campaign to finally get the message through. And it required a message from the Russians, we think, to Milosevic, who was someone they were backing, to basically call it a day, stop it. Now, if you look at the international situation today, we're not in a position to work with the United Nations and the Security Council in this manner. Because the Russians under President Putin have been highly protective of Syria and have been prepared to block any effort to get any meaningful Security Council resolution out there. And the Chinese government is more or less in the same frame of mind. That means that one of the most powerful devices we had in the Clinton administration for mobilizing public opinion isn't available to the Obama administration. That device is enough unanimity in the international community so that resolutions that would have real teeth in them could be passed and enforced. In an odd sort of way, it demonstrates the importance of institutions like the United Nations, because when they can't function, you really feel the contrast to other periods of time when they are able to pull together and say something in a more or less united way. So, you are right that there are similarities, okay, but you have to pay attention to the differences because they're pretty critical. The differences really determine what the United States can and cannot do, representing the opinion of the rest of the planet in a situation like this. And so, you know, sitting on the outside of the government and not knowing what their deliberations are, I sense that every day they must be confronting this problem of how to bring influence to bear short of unilateral military force in a way that would call these hostilities to a conclusion. Also, it goes back again to the question of hatred. And I don't think as human beings we know how to make it go away. The only question is how to persuade people to stop doing these things to each other, and unfortunately one of the answers is it continues until it burns out. I think that's not the desire of the United States. Our desire is to stop the bloodshed and to leave in place some way to reconstruct. But so far, I don't think anybody's got the magic solution for it.
I like Leon's formula of asking yourself what you would do, and remember that policymakers have to deal with the consequences of the decisions they make. I've often asked myself, what would could Franklin Roosevelt have intervened early on in the 1930s against Germany with a tremendous different impact that might have had? Could President Eisenhower have acted differently with regard to the Soviet invasion of Hungary in 1956? What about Lyndon Johnson in 1968 when the Czechoslovakia was invaded? I think you can always come up with an answer that would construct an option that might have worked, but you're not usually not looking very carefully at the environment in which they had to make the decisions they made. And I think with regard to, you raised the issue of Syria, I think Leon has said what I would want to say about it. It really is different there. And the question I've asked myself about Syria, because I think the suffering there is very real. The ugly repressiveness of the Bashar al-Assad regime is very real. But I think the question that if the president were to ask me, can we intervene there militarily without having to put U.S. boots on the ground, I would not be able to give him a satisfactory answer. I think it's very difficult for us to intervene in that kind of situation, in that kind of neighborhood, with all the other influences that are impacting the proxy war that's being fought there, with support from the Russians, with support from Hezbollah, from Iran, and then the various sects and groups within Syria itself that have to be taken into account. It's a very complex situation, and without having troops already on the ground there, it makes it very difficult to assess what the impact for the United States would be. So, by the way, there's also the question of when you intervene. And so a very difficult situation for the president. So I tend to be sympathetic with presidents who have to make these decisions. And I think right now we are, our country is, we're withdrawing from Iraq, which took much longer than we expected. We have not yet fully withdrawn from Afghanistan. We have, I think, an exhausted military. We have been forced to redeploy our military forces multiple times in the Iraqi and Afghan conflicts to a degree that it has, I think, put a tremendous burden on the military services and the individuals, individual lives of those servicemen who have served us so well. So this is a very heavy responsibility, I think, in responding to the question of should we intervene and what would the consequences be. And I would not be able to, I would want to be able to say there's something we can do, but with direct military intervention, I would not be able to say you will not end up with troops on the ground. And for a country that already has, its military has already suffered from too many boots on the ground, I would be hesitant to give the answer. So I'm really not answering your question satisfactorily, but I hope I'm conveying to you the complexity of the issues that are involved.
And I think we have time for 2 more questions from the floor. Go ahead.
First of all, I want to thank you both for being here for these kids. I have a number of students in the room who have recently been to Croatia, and all of us who went were just amazed at the people and their resilience. One of the conversations that I had with a local person who was very thankful that there was peace right now, we got into the history of the Balkans, and I began to wonder, you know, first, what do you guys see as the fallout from all of this for the future of the region? And second, when you make foreign policy decisions, do you look to the future, or are you just trying to put out fires at the time? Are there issues that have yet to be resolved that are still, just like the last 200 years, going to cause a flare-up in the future in the Balkans?
Okay, well, there's a lot that has happened in all those years. the former parts of Yugoslavia have now become independent nations and states. Croatia, I think, was just recently admitted to the European Union. I think we saw an opportunity to deal with this question of the persistence of hatred by taking advantage of the fact that there existed larger institutions that had already managed to deal with hatred in the course of their creation. And so parts of the former Yugoslavia wound up as independent countries entering the European Union, or entering the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or entering both of them. Those are organizations in which former deadly enemies had been allies and friends for more than one generation. So if there's any way to demonstrate that you can put the past behind you, those institutions show it. And by opening them up to membership by countries that had previously nourished very ancient hatreds, I think we created another path into a different kind of future for them to take. So that's just one of the major fallouts, as you call it, of at the other end of this conflict. I mean, we live in a tremendously different world now than those people did then, and you're going to live in a hugely different world than the one we have now. Every part of it is in motion to somewhere else. Every part of it is being transformed. So, you know, there is this ancient Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. It's not just a curse, it can also be a blessing. You'll have an opportunity to be active, maybe in public life, at a time when all sorts of possibilities are open that previously could not have been dreamed of. And so, I mean, I'd like to encourage you to keep your eyes open, to look at the way things are changing. And my final comment is this. Often you have to make decisions that are very fast. But even when you make those decisions, you need to be mindful of their long-term consequences. Sometimes you have the luxury of beginning to think way in advance about what might happen, and that's better. But there's one rule that you have to keep in mind. Nothing turns out the way you expected when you make any of these decisions. Anytime somebody comes to you and says, if you do A, which I recommend, then B, which you wish will surely come, think twice about swallowing that one. The world is based on surprise. All human activities lead to things that were not thought of and were not planned at the time the decision was made. Change is the permanent rule. Surprise comes with that change. And so once again, given that you are entering a very interesting period of history in the world, learn how these systems work, learn how they interact with each other, because that sense of things are connected in surprising ways is going to be the most valuable knowledge that you have as you go forward.
I think Leon hit it right on. I think there is always, certainly, even on the margins of intelligence support and then policy deliberations, the future. And I think particularly with the case of Croatia, which always had more of an interest in getting into Europe than dealing with anything to the south in Yugoslavia. The requirements for getting into the European Union, not only do you have to meet very clear economic standards, but also there are human rights requirements that have to be met, and both Croatia and then Serbia now trying to follow suit. They've had to cooperate in turning in some of the leaders in that Bosnian conflict to the War Crimes Tribunal. So you are seeing those, so that was an investment in the future. And I think the whole effort, I would argue, of our policymakers in bringing the peace to the Balkans was to get people away from their past and into a brighter future. But they are being required to meet real standards to get there, which I think is a good thing. Your question about sort of prioritization, I'll just throw you out one little, not anecdote, but directly from my experience. One of the jobs that I had as Assistant Director for Analysis and Production was to look ahead and at how resources were being allocated. And so to do that, I took a year, 1998, and we looked across the intelligence community, and I established what priorities we were working on in the intelligence community at the beginning of 1998 and what we were resourcing. And then at the end of 1998, asked how we did. At the end of 1998, and some of you weren't born there by that time, is that possible? I hate to ask this question, but in fact, that was a year where we had a global financial crisis. That was a year, and a global financial crisis, by the way, that affected everything from Thailand. It was literally wiping out middle class in Indonesia, a major impact in Russia. We worried about it affecting Argentina. So the tremendous intelligence resources had to be devoted there. We had the terrorist attacks in Dar es Salaam and Nairobi, major issues which diverted attentions. We had an uptick in demand for resources because of the growing crisis in Kosovo. So all of those things resulted at the end of that year in having 53% of the priorities we were working on at the end of the year were not priorities at all at the beginning. I think in the management of foreign policy, and this is another way of saying what Leon said, you're dealing with a very unpredictable world where there is a demand for response, and it is always a struggle to get away from the tactical demands, which are very heavy, to deal with the strategic issues that most people want to. And I have been through the experience of the briefings of new administrations, successive administrations, that they come in, and they always say, we are going to be strategic. Those last guys got buried in tactics. We're going to be strategic. And for about 6 months, or maybe less, depending how the world treats them, it's less. It is less. And in my experience, as a crisis develops, almost all of us are in over our heads to start with. Everybody struggles, and you establish patterns to deal with the crises. But it is very difficult, I think, in the nature of government dealing with foreign policy, to be strategic, to come into work and say, we're going to improve the world in the following 10 ways on a given day. The world just won't let you do that. And I think the great strength of our system is that we do have a government that's been able to respond, not always instantly, by the way. It's a lot easier for individuals to think, I know what the solution is, than for a government with all the variables it has to deal with to come up with instant solutions. But I think we do a pretty good job of, when we do, evolve to that point where we get our act together, we are quite effective in dealing with the world that we deal with.
And we'll have time for one more question after your comment.
I'd like to talk about actually an intelligence product that you can get hold of and read on the internet. This is the National Intelligence Council's global trends. Now, it's on a cycle about 5 years, once every 5 years? 5 years. Every 5 years, and the latest one is the world in 2030. The National Intelligence Council is a kind of freestanding body inside of the intelligence community. John ran it. And so I'm stealing his thunder here. But I can say things that he might not want to say, just for reasons of modesty. Nobody knows how to accurately portray the future. And there are all sorts of ways of imagining what alternative futures look like. But the National Intelligence Council's series is an effort to progressively improve the ability to visualize the future as a means to be thinking in long-range terms about how best to be prepared for it. And so, I mean, a number of my colleagues who are professional students of forecasting in the future have found all sorts of things to criticize in it, and they may be there. But the one point is that at this point, the U.S. government has a group of some of its best thinkers, not only working on this themselves, but reaching out to the rest of the world to try to present back an idea of how the world in all of its complexity is evolving. And you can read this report on the internet. I'm not sure exactly where you would find it, but if you just typed in the world in, what?
CIA.com.
Yeah. So my advice to you is get hold of that and use it to help you think about what is coming towards us, especially at such long range as 2030.
One more question, the gentleman in the suit, front row.
Yes, I would like to know if we were to have a major war like World War III at this time with troops still in Syria and Iraq, will we be able to have allies in other countries that would help us during the fight?
If we have another major world war, particularly when we still have troops stationed in the Middle East, will we be able to meet the challenge of that world war? Or are we stretched too thin right now, our resources?
You want to go ahead? This is a personal view. I think we are stretched thin militarily. So you would have to have and it's hard for me to envision how another world war, and I hope we will not have another world war, and I think we should be working overtime to ensure that we will not have another world war. But even another conflict that would require the United States to invade another country right now, I think would be a great strain on our resources. So there would have to be a real baseline assessment of our military capabilities and how we deal with it. The issue of building alliances with other countries or with building coalitions of the willing who will engage with us. This is Leon is the expert here, but intelligence officers, by the way, love to play policymaker when they get in these forums, so I probably overstep my bounds here, but I think my observation has been that it is more difficult to achieve coalitions than it was during the Cold War, certainly, when the threat from the Soviet Union was kind of universally accepted among so many countries abroad. And so that I think it is, as great as that threat was, I think it was easier for us to build coalitions when we were dealing with the Soviet threat. I think it's a much more complicated world today, and I think it's much harder to build coalitions. It's almost issue by issue that we have to deal with them now, so it's harder to do. But with regard to the thought of military intervention, I think I surely hope that as your generation ascends to positions of authority and power in our government, you will see the military instrument as one you want to use less and less, and I think you will find it more difficult to develop strategies to use it, except in very surgical kinds of ways, as opposed to a global world war. And I certainly can't think of any reason why, for example, the United States and China, it would seem to me it is so clearly in the interests of both countries not to have our relationship end in conflict that I think we'd have to do everything we can to stay engaged in a way to prevent it. And that's where diplomacy, I believe, becomes in many ways more important than military force in the kind of world we're living in today.
I guess the only thing I want to say is that it's a real question, because while the idea of a world war has become a kind of remote thought, the means to conduct it are very much in existence. And since we're human beings and we make some dreadful mistakes, as you grow up, I think you should begin to study things like the history of arms control, methods for preventing unintentional war, issues of stability, questions that come out of choices we make on all sides about what new weapons to deploy. There's enough destructive power on one nuclear-armed submarine to essentially end most of civilization as we know it. And so while we are fortunate that that kind of nightmare has receded, your generation will pick up the responsibility for making sure that it continues to recede and that it stays chained in the cave where it belongs.
Presidential decision-making is no easy task. Intelligence gathering can be difficult too, particularly when it comes to conflicts abroad. But people try their best every day to not only keep Americans safe, but keep some stability in the world. And on behalf of the Clinton Presidential Center and all of these students, gentlemen, we want to thank you for talking with us today. Let's give them a round of applause. I know that there are some questions that didn't get answered, some wonderful questions from the audience, but I would encourage all of you as well to go to the CIA Fact Book, which is also online. You can Google it, and it has some important information on countries that can always be helpful for different reports. Thank you all so much for coming out today.
So now what?